CNRM is the Center for Neuroscience and Regenerative Medicine. The mission is to do great science that improves outcomes for military service members with traumatic brain injury. CNRM will fulfill its mission through a strategic approach, which will involve clinical trials, testing new therapeutics in military traumatic brain injury patients to find out what works and what doesn't, and by developing new knowledge that will lead to better treatments and better diagnostics specifically relevant to military traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is a very serious issue for military service members. There are hundreds of thousands of service members that are suffering long-term consequences of traumatic brain injury, and it's critical that we move forward to take decisive scientific action that will improve their outcomes. CNRM was established in 2008 as part of an act of Congress. Money was allocated to the Uniformed Services University to create a new collaboration between the Uniformed Services University and the National Institutes of Health right across the street from each other.
The goal of all the work is to provide new treatments or the best treatments available to a given patient to then improve their outcome from a given stage of traumatic brain injury. And no treatment that we know of now really can tell us exactly how to do that. So we have to do the research, we have to depend on the volunteers to participate and really see what measures are going to work.
It's important for people to participate because the participants that come in and then the information that they provide enables us to learn more about traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. It enables us to create better diagnostic, treatment, and prevention strategies for those conditions. If you're interested in participating in research, we're at different military treatment facilities such as Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, Fort Belvoir Community Hospital. We're also at National Institutes of Health and different local hospitals within the DC area. They can also contact us through our online registry. If they're maybe not within the DC area, they can reach out to us and we'll get them involved. If an individual decides to participate in this study, we would do a quick pre-screening process just to make sure we have all their contact information and to make sure they're eligible. And then once they came in for the study, we would get them consented to the study, and then we'd start the study assessments. If someone's a little apprehensive about participating in research, I would want to assure them that they are more than welcome to stop at any time. They're not obligated to do anything they're not comfortable with. Their safety and their confidentiality is most important to us, and that we really value and respect them as a participant for our research studies.
When we first start a study, we do what's called an informed consent process. So I will go over a consent form with them. That explains all of the details of the procedures to them, and I try to convey all of that in as understandable terms as possible and ask them if they have any questions, have them repeat some of it back to me so I know that they understand what the study involves. And as part of that, I make it clear to them that they are free to withdraw at any time. So even though they sign a consent form saying they agree to take part, they can change their mind anytime.
Well, after a nearly 30-year career in the military, I know very well what it's like to be scared of confidentiality and how that might affect one's military career. One thing I noticed over my career in the Army is that it never did. So there's this stigma attached to seeing somebody in behavioral health or admitting that you have a traumatic brain injury, and somehow that's going to adversely affect your career, and that's just not the case. And in fact, it can be just the opposite. If you have a behavioral health problem or you have a problem with brain injury and that adversely affects your performance, and your command does not know about that or address that, it would be more likely to negatively impact your career by not having those issues addressed than by having those issues addressed.
Blast injuries can be very severe or can be very subtle, and sometimes subtle changes can be unrecognized. People come home and they're a little bit different. They might be a little bit anxious, might have trouble sleeping, might have headaches, might be forgetful. And if you're home and things aren't right, it's a good idea to to check and see what could be wrong. The deployment time should not be a consideration with regard to enrolling in a study. There are many studies where there's an initial encounter and that takes place at a medical facility, and other things are conducted by email, by telephone, by distance, and are accomplished yearly or can have gaps of several months or years in between and still be part of a study and still give us valid information.
The things we do in our long-term study is really do an in-depth analysis, a 2 to 4 day in-depth analysis of their cognitive function, their physical function, how their brain looks on an MRI, their blood biomarkers. And so to a certain extent, that is of use to some individuals. And then many individuals and volunteers just do it because they feel like they want to give back. And ultimately they want to, help find cures for these really, really difficult problems.
So in radiology, there's different technologies that we can use to image the human body, and in our case, the brain. The most commonly studied technologies for studying the brain are going to be MRI, which stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and PET, which stands for positron emission tomography. What MRI does is it uses a very powerful magnet as well as radio frequency waves, the same kind of radio frequency waves that you listen to your car radio on, for example, to generate images of the human body. It's very good at showing structural information about the brain. There's essentially no preparation except maybe letting us know what kind of metal or electronics that you might have in your body. If you have something implanted, it's important that you find out what's the make and model of that implant so that we can look it up and make sure that it's MRI safe. Once you get to the MRI check-in area, we'll ask you to take all electronics and metal out of your pockets. Anything that can be removed should be removed, and we'll change you into a hospital gown for the duration of the scan. PET has the advantage of showing where specific molecules are being taken up by the brain. That's why PET imaging is also often known as molecular imaging. For PET, what we do is we inject a radioactive tracer into the body. This radioactive tracer usually decays pretty rapidly so that you're no longer radioactive after a short period of time. This radioactive tracer is taken up by different tissues in the body, and that lets us generate images of the brain through a different mechanism. The more information we gather about using these techniques, both in healthy and unhealthy brains, symptomatic and unsymptomatic brains, the faster we'll be able to get to an answer about how these can help patients who are exposed to trauma or stress.
The image processing core develops and applies computer algorithms to help extract information from medical images that are acquired through MRI or PET. So CNRM was one of the first installations of a simultaneous PET MRI scanner within the United States. So our group has developed a patent-pending procedure to actually see missing connections perhaps, or shortened connections. And then there's also a large number of quantitative measurements that characterizes how well connected different regions within the brain are connected to each other. And we can compare that across individuals, between healthy individuals and unhealthy individuals, and see what the differences are. So if there's a healing process or repairing process, we can monitor that, especially if there's a therapy that's being administered to a patient.
We use peripheral samples of blood because that's what's available to us in these individuals who have mild or moderate injuries, and that we can get a sample of blood just as a clinical routine, and we can actually use that blood and understand what's going on in the brain through a lot of different processes. And what we're looking for in that blood is identifiers that might make somebody more at risk to have neurological deficits or psychological symptoms following a brain injury. And so we use that blood to look at things like proteins, maybe inflammation. We also look at the function of genes to better understand how genes might play in to some of the recovery networks that we know are implicated in traumatic brain injury, but we're not quite sure how to treat it. So we're using the biomarkers as a way to identify patients at risk, as well as to identify ways that we might be able to treat them better.
Well, CNRM Biospecimen Repository, we receive specimens from various clinical sites. And with that, the specimens that we receive are de-identified. And de-identified basically means that we do not receive any patient information, such as their name, social security number, date of birth, or gender. Then we store them into our secure freezers. They're locked in a designated space so that we're the only ones who have access to them. You have investigators who will request samples from the blood that we receive from the patients, and with that they will take and run specific assays, and in that they might find various markers within the assays that they're doing that would help give us a better understanding of traumatic brain injury and better ways to treat it for the betterment of the patient.
In CNRM and in research in general, there are two types of trials that involve human beings. One is what we call a natural history study, in which we take a group of individuals, like individuals with PTSD or like individuals with TBI, and we follow them over a long period of time. And so very much what natural history studies allow us to do is generate hypotheses around what the enemy is. The other type of trial that we do here is something called a treatment trial or an experimental trial. And that's an experiment, and we're actually trying to test whether one intervention works better or worse than another. So for instance, a classic experimental trial would be a drug trial, in which you do a placebo-controlled trial where you give somebody a pill every day, and that individual may or may not know whether or not that's the experimental pill or a sugar pill. So those are the two types of trials, and we do both of them here.
The Clinical Trials Unit has been created to develop novel treatments for the most important symptoms of traumatic brain injury, such as sleep disorders, headache, chronic pain, depression, anxiety. Clinical trials are very important because they provide a rigorous environment in which the research question can be asked in a scientific way. By doing clinical trials, I can hopefully make a difference in the lives of many more patients, because traumatic brain injury is very prevalent and is a condition that affects mostly young people, and we want to give them an active life as much as possible.
We've been using virtual reality, virtual Iraq and virtual Afghanistan, since about 2007. We were the first to show that the function of the brain significantly improves with that treatment. So they say a little bit about what happened to them, and then the therapist creates some of that in the virtual environment. It's more attractive to service members because, frankly, a lot of our younger soldiers, they're used to playing video games, being immersed in this kind of a world. And so it's appealing to them. They might say, well, yeah, talk therapy, I don't know, I don't really want to talk to somebody about this. I don't want to take another medicine. But virtual reality, wow, that sounds kind of cool. Sure, I'll come in. So it gets their foot in the door.
One of the things we do here is an interesting test called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we like to do this over the part of the brain that controls the muscles on the other side of the body, an area called the motor cortex. And that way, when we stimulate, we can look at how big the muscle twitch is. And that tells us a lot about the sensitivity of the brain and how it changes under various conditions.
When patients have a head injury or other types of neurological disorders, it frequently affects their thinking, their memory, their speed, the speed at which they process information, their ability to shift their attention. And what clinical neuropsychologists do are measure out those cognitive abilities, such as memory, attention, things like that. After a patient has an injury, as you say, they may or may not know if they're functioning at the level they were before. One of the things that we do is we also estimate what their functioning was prior to the injury. So by being able to determine sort of where they were before and where they are now, we can make a more objective assessment of where they're having problems and what those problems may be.
The Department of Defense has tasked us with getting to the bottom of this problem, and they've provided us with the resources and the wherewithal in order to study military traumatic brain injury. We've found that there are significant changes in the brain that we see in individuals who've been exposed to blast that seem to be unique, not seen in the typical impact injuries that one seasoned civilians or in automobile accidents or in contact sports, things like that. We're trying to understand the nature of the problem, and that's towards finding better ways to treat it, to prevent it, to diagnose it. This is an extremely important problem. The numbers of individuals affected is quite large. The individuals themselves are undergoing very serious changes in their life and in terms of their functioning that has completely disrupted both their personal life, their family life, their ability to serve in the military, and to be able to address a problem like that and to provide some answers is really very gratifying, and why we come to work each day.
The main reason it's important for service members to participate in CNRM studies is to help other service members that are suffering with problems related to traumatic brain injury. There are hundreds of thousands of service members who have unresolved issues relating to their traumatic brain injury, and it's only through generalizable new knowledge, the sort that we get from scientific studies, that we can globally improve the quality of care for hundreds of thousands of people, not to help themselves, but to help the other folks that are still out there.
The center brings together these institutions and the investigators and their expertise to really focus and increase the interactions that would help us develop these new technologies and new treatments and really accelerate the brain injury research that we can do. So we have to do the research, we have to depend on the volunteers to participate and really help us to bring these new methods for diagnosis and evaluation and to bring new treatments forward that we just wouldn't otherwise have had the opportunity to offer.
Together, we can make a difference.
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 Together,
We can make a difference.
Together, we can make a difference for military service members with traumatic brain injury, their families, and for society as a whole.
Please visit our website at cnrmstudies.org. Subscribe to our Facebook page, Twitter feed, YouTube channel, and Instagram. That's where you'll have access to TBI and PTS resources. Please give us a call. We would love to hear from you. Together, we can make a difference.